The journey to North Cumberland felt like crossing the edge of the world. For 3 days, the carriage carried Annalise and Gideon away from the glittering, deceitful heart of London. The city's cruel whispers faded, replaced by the howling wind of the northern moors. When Blackwood Manor finally appeared on the horizon, Annalise understood why they called him the Ruthless Duke. The estate was not merely a home, it was a fortress. Built of dark, heavy stone, it stood against the grey sky like a sleeping giant. Towers pierced the low winter clouds, and thick ivy clung to the walls like iron veins. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was terribly cold. Gideon sat across from her in the carriage. He had been quiet for most of the journey. The man who had effortlessly ruined Lord Richard Beaumont, the man who had let his walls crumble in a small London garden, was now retreating back into his armor. He watched the manor approach with a guarded, unreadable expression. "It is formidable," Annalise said softly, breaking the heavy silence. Gideon turned his dark eyes toward her. "It is isolated," he corrected. "My ancestors built it to withstand sieges. Over the centuries it has become very good at keeping the world out." He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands resting in her lap. "I hope it does not feel like a prison to you, Annalise." She shook her head, holding his gaze. "I have already lived in a prison of society's expectations. This feels like breathing." A faint, almost imperceptible softening touched his jaw, but the distance remained. When the carriage halted, the massive oak doors of the manor swung open. Dozens of servants stood in perfect silent lines in the cavernous entrance hall. They were immaculate disciplined and entirely unreadable. There was no warm chatter, no welcoming smiles. Only strict absolute obedience to the Duke of North Cumberland. Gideon stepped out first and offered his hand. His touch was warm, a sharp contrast to the chilling wind sweeping across the courtyard. As Annalise stepped down, the heavy wool of her travelling cloak wrapped around her, but it could not ward off the sheer scale of her new reality. She was no longer just the ruined girl of the London season. She was the Duchess of North Cumberland. "Welcome to Blackwood, your grace." The head butler said, bowing deeply. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Annalise nodded graciously. She felt Gideon's presence beside her, a towering shadow of protection. Yet, as he led her through the grand halls, she noticed how the silence of the house seemed to swallow him whole. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The carpets were thick, muffling their footsteps completely. Every room they passed was vast, perfectly arranged, and entirely devoid of life. It felt like a museum of ghosts. "Your chambers have been prepared," Gideon said, his voice low in the quiet corridor. "They are in the east wing. They receive the morning sun. I thought you might prefer the light." "And yours?" she asked, looking up at his sharp profile. "The west wing," he replied evenly. "I keep odd hours. I did not want to disturb your rest." Annalise felt a small pang in her chest. The west wing. An entire estate separated them. The kiss they had shared in her father's garden had been a promise, but Gideon was still a man, accustomed to fighting his battles alone. He had brought her to his sanctuary, but he was not yet ready to let her fully into his soul. "I see," she murmured, hiding her disappointment behind a calm mask. That evening dinner was served in a dining hall large enough to host a royal banquet. The mahogany table was long and gleaming, reflecting the light of 100 flickering candles. Gideon sat at one end, and Annalise was placed at the far opposite end. The physical distance between them felt absurd, almost comical, if it were not so painfully symbolic. Course after course was served in absolute silence. The clinking of silverware seemed aggressively loud against the heavy quiet of the room. Annalise looked down the length of the table. Gideon was cutting his meat with precise mechanical movements. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, the exact same mask he had worn when he draped his black coat over her trembling shoulders in the Ashworth ballroom. But she knew the man beneath the mask now. She knew he possessed a heart fiercely capable of care, hidden beneath layers of stoic duty and ancient grief. She set down her fork. The sound was a sharp crack in the quiet room. Gideon paused, looking up. "Is the food?" Not to your liking? The food is excellent, Annalise said. She stood up. The servants standing near the walls shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. The Duchess was breaking protocol. Annalise picked up her wineglass and her porcelain plate. She walked the long, agonizing distance down the side of the table. Her emerald silk gown rustled softly against the polished floorboards. Gideon watched her to his dark eyes, tracking her every movement, a flicker of confusion breaking his composed facade. She reached his end of the table and calmly set her plate down on the empty setting directly to his right. She pulled out the heavy wooden chair herself before the footman could react and sat down beside him. The physical proximity changed the air in the room immediately. She could smell the faint scent of leather and cedar on his skin. She could see the slight tension in his broad shoulders. "It is a very large table, Your Grace," Annalise said softly, picking up her fork again. "I prefer not to shout when I speak to my husband." Gideon stared at her. For a long moment, the ruthless Duke looked completely disarmed. The shadows in his eyes shifted, replaced by something warm, something remarkably akin to awe. He looked at the vast empty space she had abandoned, and then down at the woman sitting confidently beside him. A slow, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth. He signaled the servants with a subtle wave of his hand. "Leave us," he commanded quietly. The servants vanished like ghosts, closing the heavy doors behind them. They were alone. "You are unpredictable, Annalise," Gideon murmured, his voice dropping to a rough velvet whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "You taught me to be unpredictable," she replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You told me not to search for approval, to act as though the world is already mine." He leaned slightly closer, the coldness of the manner entirely forgotten in the heat of his gaze. "And is it yours?" Annalise looked around the imposing yet shadowy dining hall, and then back into the eyes of the man who had saved her. "I have conquered the dining room," she said, with a faint teasing smile. "I suppose the rest of the estate will take a little more time." Gideon's low, quiet laughter filled the space between them. It was a sound Blackwood Manor had not heard in decades. And as they finished their meal, side by side, Annalise knew her true battle had only just begun. She had not come here to be a quiet ghost in a grand house. She had come to melt the frost of the ruthless Duke. The first week at Blackwood Manor passed in a slow, cautious rhythm. The estate was vast, operating like a perfectly tuned clock, yet it lacked the warmth of a living home. Gideon was often away from dawn until dusk. He rode across his expansive lands, inspected tenant farms, and locked himself in his study to manage his empire. Annalise, left to her own devices, began to map the labyrinth of her new world. She walked through long galleries of ancient armor, past libraries filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes, and sat by massive windows, watching the grey northern moors. The landscape was harsh, beautiful, and wild. It looked exactly like her husband's soul. But Annalise had not come here to be a quiet ghost in a grand, empty house. One rainy afternoon, when the sky turned the color of bruised iron and thunder rolled over the hills, she found herself wandering the upper floors of the north wing. It was a section of the house the servants seemed to avoid. The air here was colder, the silence heavier. At the very end of a shadowed narrow corridor stood a heavy mahogany door. Unlike the others, there was no polished handle, no sign of recent care. It looked entirely forgotten, intentionally sealed. Annalise hesitated, her hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob. She knew she should turn back, but something pulled her forward. She pushed the door. It was stiff, protesting with a low, groaning creak, before finally giving way. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of dried lavender, old paper, and trapped time. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut, but a sliver of pale grey light slipped through, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. White linen sheets draped over the furniture like silent, unmoving phantoms. She stepped inside, her heart beating a little faster. A grand piano sat in the corner, shrouded in cloth. A delicate dressing table held silver brushes now blackened with tarnish. But what drew Annalise's eye was the large oil painting hanging above the unlit fireplace. She moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. It was a portrait of a woman with kind, sorrowful eyes and dark raven hair. The resemblance to Gideon was undeniable. This was his mother, the previous Duchess of North Cumberland. The woman who had been dragged through the mud by cruel rumors was torn apart by a society that demanded blood for entertainment. Annalise gently lifted a corner of the sheet covering a small writing desk. Beneath it lay a collection of dried flowers crumbling into ash at the slightest touch. Beside them sat a child's wooden toy, a beautifully carved tiny horse. She picked up the toy, tracing the worn wood with her thumb. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Gideon had been just a young boy watching his mother fade away in this very room, isolated from a world that had turned its back on them. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not born of aristocratic pride. It was a monument to grief. It was a tomb. "You should not be in here." The voice came from the doorway. It was low, sharp as a blade, and dangerously quiet. Annalise gasped and turned. Gideon stood in the shadows, his broad frame filling the entrance. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle feathered beneath his skin. The warmth they had shared in the dining room days ago was entirely gone, replaced by a defensive, terrifying chill. He looked like a wolf cornered in its den, ready to tear apart anything that came too close. She did not flinch. She did not apologize or drop the wooden toy. She simply looked at him, seeing past the anger to the raw bleeding wound beneath his armor. "She was beautiful," Annalise said softly, turning her gaze back to the portrait. Gideon stepped into the room. His heavy boots echoed against the floorboards. "This wing is closed. The servants have strict orders not to clean it, not to enter it. Ever." "I am not a servant, Gideon," she replied gently, her voice steady in the quiet room. "I am your wife." He stopped a few feet away from her. The tension rolling off his body was palpable. He looked at the sheet-covered furniture, at the dust at the cold fireplace, as if looking at the room caused him physical agony. "She locked herself in here," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, broken whisper. "After the trial, after the newspapers printed their lies. She came into this room and she simply stopped living long before her heart actually gave out." Annalise closed the distance between them. She did not ask for permission. She reached out and placed her warm, delicate hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. He went perfectly still, his breath hitching in his throat. "You could not save her," Annalise whispered, her voice carrying the rhythm of a steady, calming heartbeat. "You were only a child, Gideon. It was not your duty to save her." Gideon closed his eyes. The untouchable Duke, the man who had ruined the powerful Lord Beaumont without breaking a sweat, looked suddenly devastatingly fragile. He raised his large hand and covered hers, pressing it tighter against his chest, holding onto her as if she were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "I built walls to make sure no one could ever hurt my family again," he murmured, his voice thick with old pain. "I made myself into a monster so that the world would fear me." "You are not a monster," she said fiercely, looking up into his dark, storm-filled eyes. "You are the man who stood up for me when the whole world laughed. You are my protector. But Gideon, you do not have to protect yourself from me." He opened his eyes, looking down at her with a mix of wonder and deep, aching relief. He didn't say another word, but he didn't pull away. In the quiet of that forgotten room, amidst the ghosts of his tragic past, Annalise made a silent vow. She would not just wear his title, she would bring the sun back to Blackwood Manor. She would melt the winter inside him, piece by frozen piece. Morning in the northern moors was usually a quiet affair. The mist rolled over the heather thick and white. Inside Blackwood Manor the fires crackled warmly. Annalise sat in the morning room, sipping her black tea. The heavy frost between her and Gideon had begun to thaw. He lingered longer in the mornings now. He spoke to her of his lands, his tenants, and his plans for the coming winter. But high society never truly sleeps. It waits, it watches, and it strikes when it believes you have lowered your guard. The blow came on a silver tray carried silently up by the head butler. A single heavy envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, and edged in gold. The wax seal bore a crest. Annalise recognized immediately. It was the crest of the Duke of Somerset, a man closely allied with the disgraced Earl of Danbury. Gideon picked up the letter. His jaw tightened. The faint warmth that had settled in his eyes all morning vanished instantly. The ruthless Duke returned cold and sharp, as winter ice. He broke the seal. He read the few lines of elegant script. His expression darkened into something lethal. Without a word, he crumpled the heavy paper in his massive fist and tossed it toward the roaring fireplace. It missed the flames, landing on the stone hearth. "What was that?" Annalise asked smoothly. She set her teacup down. The delicate clink echoed loudly in the tense room. "Nothing of consequence," Gideon replied. His voice was entirely too calm. It was the dangerous, heavy calm before a violent storm. "A desperate attempt by fools to remain relevant. We will ignore it." Annalise did not look away from him. She stood up. She walked slowly to the hearth and bent down. She picked up the crumpled paper and smoothed it out with careful, deliberate movements. "Annalise, leave it!" Gideon warned. His voice was a low rumble of thunder. She ignored the warning. She read the elegant, sweeping handwriting. It was an invitation. A highly exclusive grand ball, hosted by the Duchess of Somerset to celebrate the turning of the season. At the bottom, a handwritten note had been added in black ink. "We do hope the Duke of North Cumberland will finally grace us with his presence. And of course, we're simply dying to see how his new Duchess is adjusting to the isolation of the North." The words were poisoned honey. They were polite on the surface, but dripping with absolute malice. It was a challenge. A thinly veiled insult. They were implying that Gideon was keeping her locked away because she was unfit for society. They were implying she was hiding in shame just as his mother had hidden. Annalise looked up. Gideon was watching her, his large hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table until his knuckles turned white. "They are baiting us?" she said quietly. "They are vultures," Gideon shot back. The control in his voice was slipping, cracking under the weight of his rage. "They are the same hypocrites who stood by and watched my mother break. The same cowards who whispered about you in the Ashworth ballroom. They want to put you on display. They want to see if the ruined girl from London will flinch. I will not allow it." He stepped toward her, his broad frame blocking the light from the tall windows. He looked massive, protective, terrifying to anyone else, but not to her. "I will not let them near you," he whispered fiercely. "You are safe here. They cannot touch you behind these walls." Annalise looked at the smoothed-out letter in her hand. Then she looked into her husband's storm-filled eyes. She understood his fear. He was terrified of history repeating itself. He was terrified of watching another woman he cared for be torn apart by the cruelty of the world. But she was not his mother, and she was no longer the frightened, weeping girl hiding behind a marble pillar. She took a step closer to him. She did not back down from his intense, burning gaze. "Do you remember what you told me?" she asked softly. "In the carriage as we rode through Hyde Park." Gideon frowned, his breath heavy. "Annalise, you told me that society is a chessboard." She interrupted, her voice steady and clear, cutting through his anger. "You told me that men like Richard Beaumont assume I am weak, and that is why they lose. You gave me a book on stoicism. You told me to become unpredictable, to become untouchable." She reached out and placed her delicate hand flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. "If we hide behind these walls, Gideon, they win. They will whisper that the ruthless Duke is a coward, and that his Duchess is too broken to face the light. If we stay, we give them the power to define our story." Gideon stared at her. His chest rose and fell rapidly beneath her touch. "I do not care what they say about me, but I will not let them hurt you." "They cannot hurt me," Annalise said fiercely. "Not unless I give them permission, and I do not." She held up the royal invitation. "We are going to this ball," she declared. Her voice did not waver. It rang with the absolute, unshakable authority of a duchess. "We're going to walk into their grand hall, and we're going to look them in the eye. We will show them that we are not hiding. We will show them that we do not fear their whispers." Silence stretched between them. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. Gideon looked at the woman standing before him. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine. She was not a fragile doll to be kept safely on a shelf. She was a queen ready for war. The fear in his chest began to recede, replaced by a profound, overwhelming surge of pride. A slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. The ruthless Duke had returned, but this time he was not fighting his battles alone. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice dark and full of raw awe. He reached out, taking the letter from her hand, and tossed it onto the table. Then his hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against his solid body. "Very well, my Duchess," he murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. "We will return to London. We will walk into the Viper's Nest, and we will let them see exactly who they have challenged." The Somerset ballroom was a temple of gold and glass. 1,000 candles burned in massive crystal chandeliers, casting a brilliant, almost blinding light over the swirling crowd. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, the rustle of imported silks, and the sharp, dangerous hum of high society gossip. Tonight, the predators of London were dressed in their finest feathers, and they were waiting for blood. When the heavy mahogany doors of the grand entrance opened, the orchestra was playing a lively waltz. But as the herald stepped forward and struck his staff against the marble floor, the music faltered. His Grace Guardian Blackwood, the Duke of North Cumberland, the herald announced, his voice echoing into sudden silence. And Her Grace, the Duchess of North Cumberland. The entire ballroom stopped. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned toward the grand staircase. Fans paused mid-flutter. Champagne glasses hovered halfway to painted lips. Gideon stood at the top of the stairs, a towering figure carved from shadows and uncompromising power. He wore midnight blue velvet tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders, his expression as hard and unreadable as the stone walls of his northern estate. But it was the woman beside him who stole the breath from the room. Annalise did not look like the weeping, broken girl who had fled the Ashworth ballroom months ago. She looked like a queen forged in winter. Her gown was a masterpiece of deep iridescent silver, catching the candlelight like frost on a midnight lake. Diamonds heavy and ancient rested against her collarbone, the legendary Blackwood heirlooms untouched for a generation, now claiming her as their rightful mistress. She did not clutch Gideon's arm for support. She rested her hand lightly upon his sleeve, her posture flawless, her chin tilted with calm, devastating authority. "Look at them," Gideon murmured softly, his voice meant only for her. "They are holding their breath." "Let them," Annalise replied, her gaze sweeping over the sea of staring faces. "They will learn to exhale when we allow it." A low, dark vibration of amusement rumbled in Gideon's chest. He led her down the marble steps. The crowd parted instantly, giving them a wide berth. The whispers began hissing like snakes in the tall grass, but Annalise did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She walked with the slow, measured grace of a predator, entering a cage of frightened birds. Before they could reach the other side of the room, the crowd shifted. The Duchess of Somerset, a woman known for her sharp tongue and cruel alliances, stepped into their path. She wore a garish gown of ruby red surrounded by a tight circle of her loyal sycophants. "Your Grace!" The Duchess of Somerset cooed, executing a shallow, mocking curtsy. "What an absolute shock to see you here! We were quite certain the northern winds had blown you away forever. Or perhaps that the Duke had decided to keep his new prize locked in his terrible, gloomy tower." A few soft, nervous titters rose from her circle. Gideon's jaw hardened. The air around him turned instantly frigid. He opened his mouth to shatter the woman's pride, but Annalise gently pressed her fingers against his arm. "Let me," the touch said. Gideon paused. He stepped back just a fraction of an inch, yielding the floor to his wife. Annalise smiled. It was a beautiful, terrifying smile. It held absolutely no warmth. "Your Grace?" Annalise said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent space around them. "How kind of you to worry, but you are mistaken. The North is not gloomy, it is simply vast. It requires a certain strength of character, a fortitude that cannot be distracted by trivial glittering things." She let her eyes slowly travel over the Duchess of Somerset's overly elaborate gaudy ruby gown, stopping just long enough for the insult to land perfectly. The older woman's smile tightened into a thin, angry line. "Indeed. But one must admit the Duke's reputation for isolation is quite well known. Some say he is entirely uncivilized, a beast of the moors. It must be terribly frightening for a young girl like you to manage such a temper." The insult was direct. It was aimed at Gideon's past, at the tragic rumors of his family. The silence in the ballroom became absolute. Annalise did not raise her voice. She did not show a single flash of anger. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her silver eyes locking onto the Duchess of Somerset, with a cold, piercing intensity that made the older woman instinctively take a step back. "A beast," Annalise repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. "My husband is only a beast to those who lack honor, Your Grace, to the cowards who hide their cruelty behind silk fans and polite smiles. To them he is a nightmare." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a silken, lethal whisper. "But to the rest of the world he is the law, and I assure you, I do not find the law frightening. I find it exactly where I belong." The Duchess of Somerset opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. Her face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. The sycophants behind her looked down at the floor, suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. Annalise had not just defended her husband, she had stripped the Duchess of her power in front of the entire London elite, using nothing but polite, weaponized truth. Now, Annalise said smoothly, turning her attention away as if the woman had ceased to exist. If you will excuse us, the air in this corner has grown terribly stale. She guided Gideon past the stunned group. The crowd parted even wider than before. No one dared to whisper now. They looked at Annalise, not with pity and not with curiosity. They looked at her with genuine fear and profound respect. Gideon walked beside her in absolute silence. His heart was hammering against his ribs. But he had spent his entire life destroying his enemies with brute force and financial ruin. But he had never seen anyone dismantle a room full of monsters with such elegant, effortless grace. He looked down at his wife. The chandeliers caught the diamonds at her throat, but they were dull compared to the fierce, triumphant fire in her eyes. She had not needed him to save her tonight. She had saved him. She had taken his dark, bruised honor and held it up like a shield, daring the world to try and break it. He realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that he was entirely, hopelessly at her mercy. The ruthless Duke of North Cumberland had finally been conquered, and he had never felt more alive. The carriage ride back to their London townhouse was suffocatingly quiet. But it was not the cold, distant silence of the northern moors. It was a heavy electric quiet. The air inside the dark cabin hummed with an invisible, frantic energy. The rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves against the cobblestones felt like the beating of a single massive heart. Gideon sat in the shadows. He did not speak. He did not move. But Annalise could feel the weight of his gaze burning into her in the dark. It was a physical sensation, a heat that radiated across the small space between them, making it difficult for her to draw a full breath. When the carriage finally stopped, he did not wait for the footman. He threw the heavy door open himself and offered his hand. His grip was tight. Too tight. It was the grip of a man holding onto the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall, yet desperately longing to jump. They entered the grand foyer of the townhouse. The servants had left a few lamps burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the checkered marble floors. Gideon dismissed the sleepy butler with a single sharp jerk of his chin. The heavy front door clicked shut. The metallic sound echoed in the vast space, and they were entirely alone. Annalise reached up to unfasten the heavy velvet cloak from her shoulders, but before her trembling fingers could find the silver clasp, Gideon was there. He moved with a sudden terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in a single fluid stride. He did not touch her at first. He simply stood over her, his broad chest heaving, his dark eyes wide and wild. The mask of the ruthless Duke was gone, completely irreparably shattered. In its place was a man stripped bare raw and violently alive. "Why did you do that?" he demanded. His voice was a harsh, broken rasp. It scraped against the quiet of the hall. Annalise dropped her hands. She did not step back. She tilted her chin up. "I did what was necessary." "You stood in front of the entire London elite." Gideon stepped closer, his voice dropping to a fierce, shaking whisper. "You took their poison. You drew their fire. You defended me. No one has ever defended me, Annalise. No one." "Then it was long overdue," she replied softly, meeting his turbulent, storm-filled gaze without a single ounce of fear. Gideon raised his hands. They were trembling. The man who could ruin empires with a flick of his pen, the man who commanded thousands, had hands that shook as they hovered inches from her face. Slowly, as if approaching something incredibly fragile, he cupped her cheeks. His skin was burning hot against the cool night air. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, mapping the soft lines of her face as if memorizing a miracle. "I brought you to me home to protect you," he murmured. He leaned forward until his forehead rested gently against hers. His breath was ragged, ghosting across her lips. "I thought I was supposed to be your shield. I thought I had to be the stone wall between you and the world. But tonight you stood in the center of that ballroom, and you became mine. You looked at the monsters in the dark, and you did not blink." "They are not monsters, Gideon," Annalise whispered. She reached up, covering his large, trembling hands with her own. "They are just shadows, and I am not afraid of the dark anymore. Not when I am with you." A low, agonizing groan tore from Gideon's throat. The sound was a surrender, a complete devastating surrender of the soul. He kissed her. It was not the gentle, hesitant kiss they had shared in the garden weeks ago. It was a collision. It was fire meeting ice, a sudden explosive release of months of tightly coiled tension. His mouth was hard, desperate, and fiercely demanding. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid, powerful body, lifting her slightly off the marble floor. Annalise gasped into his mouth, a sudden rush of heat making her head spin. Her hands slid up his chest, tangling in the dark, thick hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, tasting of expensive champagne, of cool night air, and of overwhelming, undeniable need. Every barrier he had ever built to keep the world away collapsed in that single, blazing moment. He poured his old grief, his simmering rage, his stubborn pride, and his desperate aching loneliness into the kiss. He walked her backward until her shoulders hit the solid oak of the heavy front door. He didn't break the kiss. He couldn't. He drank from her lips as if he had been dying of thirst his entire life. Annalise! He breathed fiercely against her mouth. He rained feverish burning kisses down her jaw, his lips tracing the line of the heavy diamond necklace at her throat. My beautiful, fierce Duchess, you are going to be the absolute ruin of me. Then let me ruin you, she whispered breathlessly, her fingers tracing the hard, tense line of his jaw. Let the ruthless Duke fall. Gideon pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The silver light from the low lamps caught the unshed tears shining in his dark gaze. The tension in his shoulders finally truly gave way. He is already gone. Gideon said, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it made his chest physically ache. I thought I needed to be a fortress to survive. I thought I needed to be a monster so the world would leave me alone. I thought my heart had frozen over permanently. He moved his hand, resting his palm flat over her heart. He felt its steady, rapid rhythm beating against the silver silk of her gown. I do not want to be a fortress anymore, Annalise. I just want to be yours. I need you. I need you to breathe. I need you to live. The raw, bleeding honesty in his words brought hot tears to her own eyes. She smiled a radiant, blinding smile that chased away the very last lingering shadows in the grand hall. You have always been mine, Gideon Blackwood, she answered softly, her voice full of absolute certainty. From the very moment you draped your coat over my shoulders in the Ashworth ballroom. You just did not know it yet. He smiled back. It was a genuine, breathtaking smile that transformed his harsh, sharp features into something devastatingly handsome. He swept her up into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as if she were the most precious treasure on earth. And as he carried her up the grand sweeping staircase toward the warmth of their shared chambers, the cold isolation of the Duke's life vanished forever, replaced by the blazing, inextinguishable fire of a love that had finally conquered the dark. The morning sun spilled across the bedchamber, painting the floor in shades of pale gold. For the first time in his life, Gideon Blackwood had woken up with peace in his heart. The heavy, suffocating weight of his past had been burned away by the fire of the previous night. Annalise lay sleeping beside him, her dark hair scattered across the white pillows. She was his anchor. She was his Duchess. But peace is a fragile thing in a city built on secrets. By noon, the golden light of the morning had been swallowed by thick grey clouds. Rain began to lash against the tall windows of the London townhouse. Inside the Duke's private study, the air was entirely frozen. Thomas Finch, Gideon's trusted solicitor, stood rigidly before the massive oak desk. His usually calm face was pale, his hands tightly gripping a damp leather satchel. How did he manage it? Gideon's voice was barely a whisper. It was not a question. It was the sound of a blade sliding slowly from its sheath. The Earl of Danbury is a desperate man, your grace, Thomas replied quietly. His son is in prison. His family name is a laughingstock. He has nothing left to lose, and so he has resorted to the shadows. He used the last of his hidden wealth to purchase the loyalty of a corrupt magistrate. Gideon stared at the parchment resting on his desk. It was a warrant. A devastating, elegantly forged warrant for the immediate arrest of Samuel Croft. They fabricated a ledger, Thomas explained, swallowing hard. They claim Mr. Croft was not a victim of the Albion trading syndicate, but a co-conspirator. They claim he helped Richard Beaumont steal the money. It is a lie, of course, a complete fabrication. but the magistrate has already signed the order. The constables are prepared to drag Mr. Croft from his home tonight and throw him into Newgate Prison. Gideon did not blink. His dark eyes remained fixed on the false document. And the Earl's price for destroying this warrant? Thomas hesitated. He looked genuinely terrified to speak the words aloud. He demands that the Duchess leave you. She must sign a public declaration stating that you coerced her into marriage, that you are a monster who orchestrated the entire scandal to steal her away. If she ruins your name, he will spare her father. Silence crashed down upon the room. It was absolute and heavy like the silence at the bottom of the ocean. Gideon stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly smooth. The man who had held his wife with such desperate, trembling tenderness only hours ago vanished. The ruthless Duke the Beast of the Northern Moors awoke. He walked to a heavy iron safe built into the stone wall of his study. He turned the dial with mechanical precision. The heavy door clicked open. From the velvet-lined shelf inside, Gideon withdrew a long-polished wooden box. He flipped the brass latches and opened it. Inside lay a pair of gleaming silver-barreled dueling pistols. They had not been fired in 10 years. They had never missed their mark. Your Grace, Thomas said, his voice shaking, you cannot. If you kill an earl in cold blood, the crown will have no choice but to hang you. The crown can try, Gideon replied. His voice held no anger. It held no emotion at all. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted his damnation. He lifted one of the heavy pistols, checking the firing mechanism with cold efficiency. The Earl of Danbury had made a fatal miscalculation. He had thought to strike at Gideon by threatening the woman he loved. He had thought to use society's polite rules to trap a wolf. But Gideon Blackwood did not play by society's rules when his family was threatened. He destroyed them. Prepare a carriage, Gideon commanded, sliding the heavy weapon inside the inner pocket of his dark coat. Have my men surround the Danbury estate. No one enters, no one leaves. Gideon, please, Thomas begged, stepping forward. Think of the Duchess. This will break her heart. Gideon paused. His hand rested on the brass doorknob of his study. His chest tightened violently at the thought of Annalise. He remembered her radiant smile in the grand hall. He remembered the soft, trusting way she had slept in his arms. He knew that returning to her with blood on his hands might shatter the beautiful, fragile world they had just begun to build. But he would gladly burn in hell if it meant keeping her safe. She will be protected, Gideon said softly, even if I must become the monster she claims I am not. He pulled open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor. The shadows seemed to bend and warp around his massive frame. He was a force of pure violent nature, a storm of vengeance about to be unleashed upon London. But as he turned toward the grand staircase, a slender figure stepped out of the shadows blocking his path. Annalise stood in the center of the hallway. She wore a simple day dress of deep sapphire, her dark hair pinned back elegantly. She looked small against the vastness of the corridor, but she did not look fragile. Her silver eyes dropped to the heavy bulge of the pistol hidden inside his coat. Then she looked up, meeting his terrifying empty gaze without a single flinch. And exactly where do you think you are going, Your Grace? She asked. Her voice was perfectly calm, ringing like a clear bell in the tense, suffocating air. Gideon froze. The wolf had been unleashed, but its master stood directly in its path. Move aside, Annalise, Gideon warned. His voice was not loud, but it vibrated with a dark, lethal promise. This is not a matter for a duchess. It is a matter concerning my father, she countered smoothly, not yielding a single inch. Which makes it my battle as much as yours. She reached out. Her delicate hand slipped inside the heavy wool of his coat. She felt the cold, hard steel of the dueling pistol. She did not flinch. She simply wrapped her slender fingers around the grip and slowly, deliberately pulled the weapon from his pocket. Gideon's jaw clenched so tightly the bone looked ready to snap. Annalise, he has forged a warrant. The constables are coming for Samuel tonight. If I do not stop Danbury now, your father will rot in Newgate Prison. And if you shoot an earl in the street, you will hang at the gallows, she said fiercely. She held the heavy weapon between them, a physical barrier against his worst instincts. I did not melt the ice around your heart just to watch you throw your life away for a coward. Gideon stared at her. The violent, chaotic storm in his dark eyes clashed against the unyielding silver of hers. I am a monster when I need to be. He whispered, his voice thick with a desperate protective agony. I will gladly be a monster to keep you safe. I do not need a monster. She replied softly, stepping closer until the pistol was pressed safely between their bodies. I need a husband. I need a partner. We are not going to use bullets, Gideon. We're going to use our minds. She turned and walked past him, carrying the pistol back into the study. She placed it gently onto the oak desk, right beside the forged warrant. Thomas Finch let out a long, shaky breath he had not realized he was holding. Gideon followed her. The lethal, blinding tension in his shoulders was slowly transforming into a sharp, focused curiosity. He watched his wife study the board. Annalise looked down at the parchment. Mr. Finch, you said the Earl used the last of his hidden wealth to purchase this magistrate. But the Danbury estate is bankrupt. Where did he find the gold? Thomas blinked quickly, adjusting his spectacles. He secured a clandestine loan, Your Grace, from the Lombard Street Bank. He used the deed to his unentailed country manor as collateral. Annalise looked up, her eyes locking onto Gideon's across the room. You are the wealthiest duke in England. Can you purchase that debt? Gideon went perfectly still. His brilliant strategic mind caught her thread instantly. The bloodlust faded entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating precision that had built his massive empire. If I buy the debt, Gideon murmured, stepping up beside her, his voice dropping to a low, thrilling octave. I own the collateral. I can call the loan in immediately, within the hour. And if he cannot pay... Annalise continued, her voice gaining a dangerous, elegant momentum. You seize the funds. The very gold he used to bribe the magistrate becomes your property, legally. But the warrant is already signed. Thomas interjected nervously, looking between the two of them. Gideon smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just found a much better, much crueler way to skin his prey. A magistrate who accepts a bribe is a criminal. But a magistrate who accepts stolen funds legally belonging to the Duke of North Cumberland has committed treason against a peer of the realm. I do not need to shoot Danbury. I just need to pay a visit to the Home Secretary. He is a very close friend of my late father. The execution of the trap was a masterpiece of bloodless warfare. It was swift, it was elegant, and it was absolutely devastating. Within 2 hours, Gideon's financial agents had legally acquired the Danbury debt. Within 3 hours, the Home Secretary had reviewed the undeniable, pristine paper trail. The gold used for the bribe was traced frozen and confiscated by the Crown. As the sun began to set over London, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and violent red, the Earl of Danbury sat in his private study. He was swirling a glass of expensive brandy, waiting eagerly for the news of Samuel Croft's arrest. Instead, the heavy front doors of his townhouse were forced open with a deafening crash. But it was not Gideon Blackwood holding a pistol. It was the Chief Inspector of Scotland Yard, flanked by 6 armed officers. And standing quietly in the foyer behind them, cloaked in the elegant shadows of the evening, were the Duke and Duchess of North Cumberland. The Earl dropped his glass. The crystal shattered against the floorboards, the amber liquid bleeding into the carpet. Lord Danbury! The inspector announced sharply, holding up a heavy document bearing the royal seal. You are under arrest for the bribery of a Crown official, conspiracy to commit fraud, and extortion. Danbury's face turned the color of wet ash. He looked past the armed officers, his terrified wide eyes meeting Gideon's. He expected gloating. He expected rage. But Gideon did not speak. He did not even look at the Earl. He was looking down at Annalise. Annalise stepped forward, her sapphire dress sweeping gracefully over the threshold. She looked at the ruined, pathetic man who had tried to destroy her family not once, but twice. You played the game very poorly, my lord, Annalise said quietly. Her voice was steady, carrying the full, crushing weight of her new title. You assumed we would fight like beasts. You assumed a scandal would break us. But we are the architects of this board, and your king is captured. The officers dragged the Earl away. He did not fight. He was utterly broken, stripped of his wealth, his title, and his freedom, all within the span of a single afternoon. The forged warrant was nothing more than ash in a fireplace. Annalise stood in the empty doorway, feeling the cool evening breeze against her face. Gideon stepped up behind her. He did not carry the scent of gunpowder or blood. He carried the scent of rain leather, an absolute victory. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He buried his face in the soft curve of her neck, breathing her in as if she were the only air left in the world. "Remind me," Gideon murmured, his voice a low, reverent vibration against her warm skin, "to never ever become your enemy." Annalise smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "You could never be my enemy, Gideon. You are my heart." The journey back to the northern moors felt entirely different this time. They were no longer fleeing the cruel whispers of London society. They were returning as conquerors. The heavy grey clouds that usually clung to the peaks of North Cumberland seemed to break as their carriage rolled through the ancient iron gates of Blackwood Manor. Golden shafts of late autumn sunlight pierced the mist, illuminating the dark stone fortress and turning the frost-covered heather into a sea of glittering diamonds. When the heavy oak doors of the manor swung open, the silence of the grand entrance hall was gone. The servants who had once stood like unmoving statues now moved with a quiet, undeniable lightness. Fires roared in the massive stone hearths, chasing the ancient dampness from the air. Fresh flowers ordered from the southern glass houses brought vibrant splashes of colour to the austere shadowed corridors. Blackwood Manor was no longer a tomb. It had finally remembered how to breathe. That evening, the storm winds returned howling against the thick glass of the tall windows. But inside the Duke's private chambers, the air was heavy with intoxicating warmth. Gideon stood by the roaring fire. He had discarded his formal coat and cravat, his white linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar. The flickering orange light danced across the sharp, harsh angles of his face, but the absolute terrifying tension that had defined his entire life was completely gone. He looked exhausted, yet profoundly, deeply at peace. Annalise walked slowly into the room. She wore a simple dressing gown of ivory silk, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She moved toward him, the faint rustle of the fabric, the only sound in the quiet space. When she reached him, she did not speak. She simply wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against the broad, solid expanse of his back. Gideon closed his eyes, letting out a long, ragged breath that seemed to carry the very last of his old ghosts away. He turned in her arms, wrapping her in a fierce, protective embrace that lifted her slightly off her feet. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the sweet, calming scent of lavender and rain that belonged entirely to her. "I almost lost everything," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. "When I stood in that study with the pistol in my hand, I was prepared to throw my life away. I was prepared to burn the world to the ground if it meant keeping you safe." Annalise leaned back, reaching up to cup his face. Her thumbs brushed over the rough shadow of his jaw. "But you didn't," she said softly, her silver eyes shining with fierce, unwavering pride. "You listened to me. You trusted me." "I will always trust you," Gideon replied. He looked down at her with a devotion so absolute, so raw, it made her heart physically ache. "You did not just save my life in London, Annalise. You saved my soul. You reached into the darkest, coldest parts of my mind, and you pulled me into the light." He stepped back just a fraction, reaching into the pocket of his trousers. He pulled out a single heavy brass key. It was old, the metal darkened by decades of neglect. He took her delicate hand and pressed the cold metal firmly into her palm, folding her fingers over it. "This is the key to the north wing," he said quietly. "To my mother's chambers. I have kept it locked for 15 years because I believed the grief inside would eventually consume me. I believed the Blackwood legacy was nothing but shadows." Annalise looked down at the heavy key, a lump forming in her throat. "Tomorrow," Gideon continued, his voice steady and full of quiet courage, "we will open those doors together. We will throw back the heavy curtains. We will let the sun shine on her portrait. Because you have taught me that we do not have to hide from the pain of the past. We can survive it. We can rise above it." Tears spilled over Annalise's lashes, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. She smiled, a radiant, beautiful smile that revivaled the dawn. She let the key fall to the thick carpet and threw her arms around his neck, pulling his mouth down to hers. The kiss was slow, deep, and beautifully reverent. It was a silent vow written in the breathless language of touch. Gideon's large hands swept down her spine, drawing her flush against his burning heat. He kissed the tears from her cheeks, his lips trailing down to the sensitive skin of her throat, making her gasp his name. There was no rush, no frantic desperation. They had the rest of their lives He carried her to the massive velvet-draped bed, laying her down as if she were made of the most precious spun glass. In the glow of the dying fire, the ruthless Duke surrendered the very last pieces of his heart to the woman who had conquered his world, without ever raising a sword. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the rugged northern peaks, the Duke and Duchess of North Cumberland stood side by side on the high stone balcony. The bitter wind swept through their hair, but neither of them shivered. Gideon's arm was wrapped tightly around Annalise's waist, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. They looked out over the vast, untamed moors, a wild, beautiful empire that now belonged to both of them. The frost had finally melted. The long winter of Gideon Blackwood's soul was over, banished forever by the fierce, brilliant light of a love that refused to break. And so, the legend of the ruthless Duke and his fearless Duchess was written into the very stones of Blackwood Manor. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest power is not found in fear or isolation, but in the courage to bare your heart to the one person brave enough to hold it. What do you think was the most defining moment of Annalise and Gideon's journey? Would you have had the courage to face the Duke's darkness, or the grace to forgive the cruelty of society? Share your thoughts and favourite moments in the comments below, and let us know whose story you wish to uncover next.